What if your body did not belong to you? What if your most intimate desires, your most private acts, were not your own business, but a matter of public record? Public property, debated in courtrooms, legislated from pulpits, and dissected by scholars who believed your very organs could wander around inside you. The popular image of the Middle Ages is one of grim, pious repression. 1,000 years of chastity belts and cold stone chapels where the human libido was locked away and forgotten. That image is a comfortable fiction. The truth is far more chaotic, far more invasive, and far more insane. The medieval relationship with sex wasn't one of simple denial. It was one of obsessive, suffocating scrutiny. The medieval body was not a temple of private worship. It was a battlefield. It was a contested territory, a piece of land over which 4 great and terrible armies waged a relentless 1,000-year war for total control. First, there was the army of the church, fighting a holy war for the salvation of your soul. Armed with the concepts of sin and damnation, it sought to police every thought, every touch, every impulse, viewing your own human nature as a demonic enemy within. Then came the army of the law, fighting a secular war for lineage and social order. Armed with public courts and ritual humiliation, it cared little for your soul, but everything for your bloodline. They didn't care if you loved. They cared if your children were legitimate heirs who could inherit property. Besieging you from another front was the army of medicine, fighting a desperate blind war against an enemy it could not comprehend: your own biology. Armed with bizarre theories and horrifying remedies, these learned men saw your body not as a system to be understood, but as a rebellious province to be subdued, often with disastrous consequences. And rising from the mud and straw was the Fourth Army, the insurgency of magic. This was the guerrilla warfare of the common folk, fighting a shadow war with strange potions and whispered curses to reclaim some small measure of personal power over their own desires and the desires of others. This is not a countdown of strange historical facts. This is the chronicle of that war. We will march with each of these armies. We will learn their doctrines, witness their brutal tactics, and see the madness and cruelty born from their eternal conflict over the control of the human body. Because on this battlefield, your body was the prize, and your privacy was the first casualty of war. The first and most powerful army to lay claim to the medieval body was the church. Its theater of war was not the physical world, but the eternal soul. Its generals were the bishops and theologians, its field officers the parish priests, and its intelligence network was the confessional booth. The enemy it sought to conquer was not a foreign invader, but the very nature of humanity itself: lust. In the eyes of the church, lust or luxuria was not merely a sin. It was a gateway, a crack in the soul's fortress through which every other form of demonic influence could pour. And so, the church launched the most ambitious campaign of surveillance ever conceived, a crusade to police not just acts, but thoughts, desires, and even calendars. The primary weapon in this war was a genre of literature that is among the strangest in human history: the penitentials. These were not holy scriptures filled with soaring rhetoric. They were tactical manuals for spiritual warfare, detailed guidebooks for priests on how to interrogate a sinner's soul. Reading a penitential is like reading a secret police file on the human libido. They contain exhaustive, almost pornographic lists of every conceivable sexual act, every permutation of human desire, every forbidden fantasy. And next to each entry was a precise, calculated penalty, a prescribed number of days, months, or years of fasting, prayer, or pilgrimage. This wasn't about forgiveness, it was about jurisprudence. The confessional booth was a courtroom, the priest was the judge, and the penitentials were the law books. These manuals reveal a worldview obsessed with the minutiae of sin. It wasn't enough to confess to adultery. The priest, using his penitential, would cross-examine the sinner. How was it performed? Standing up, lying down, from behind? Was it with a virgin, a married woman, a nun, another man, or an animal? Was it merely a thought, or did it proceed to a touch, a kiss, or the final act? Each detail carried a different weight, a different tariff of penance. Fornication with a woman during her menstrual period, for example, was considered a graver sin than simple fornication, as it violated Old Testament purity laws. The Church, in its quest to save the soul, had inadvertently created the most detailed catalog of sexual deviation in the pre-modern world. The Church's war extended even into the marital bed. Marriage was sanctioned by God, yes, but only as a reluctant concession to human weakness. It was a container for lust, a way to channel the dangerous flood of desire toward its only legitimate purpose: procreation. The concept of sexual pleasure, even with one's own spouse, was deeply suspect. Theologians like St. Jerome famously argued that a man who loved his wife too ardently was, in fact, an adulterer. The act itself was a marital debt, a duty one spouse owed the other to prevent them from falling into the greater sin of fornication elsewhere. It was to be performed with grim determination, a necessary but regrettable chore for the creation of new Christian souls. To enjoy it, to seek out pleasure for its own sake, was to slide back into the sin of lust. To enforce this joyless vision, the Church drew up a complex and suffocating liturgical calendar for the libido. Your body was not your own to use when you wished. It was subject to God's timetable. Sex was forbidden on Sundays because it was the day of the resurrection. It was forbidden on Wednesdays and Fridays because those were days of fasting. It was forbidden for the 40 days of Lent, during the weeks leading up to Pentecost and before major feast days. It was forbidden if a woman was menstruating, if she was pregnant, or for 40 days after she had given birth. When one adds up all the forbidden periods, a devout medieval couple might find that sex was prohibited for more than half the year. The Church had inserted itself directly into the bedroom, its shadow falling across the marital bed, turning a natural act of human intimacy into a complex negotiation with the divine calendar. This obsession with control led to a near paranoid fear of any sexual act that could not lead to procreation. Anything that spilled the seed in vain was a grave sin, a direct affront to God's command to be fruitful and multiply. This condemned not only masturbation but also oral sex, anal sex, and even certain sexual positions within marriage. The so-called woman on top position, for instance, was seen by some theologians as a perversion of the natural order, a sign of female dominance that was both spiritually and socially dangerous. The war for the soul was a war of microscopic control. The Church sought to regulate the internal world of every Christian to become the ultimate arbiter of desire. It created a psychological landscape where the most natural human impulses were a source of constant anxiety and guilt. Every loving touch held the potential for damnation. Every moment of passion was a victory for the devil. In its quest to purify humanity, the Church had declared war on human nature itself. It was a war it could never truly win, but in fighting it, it held the power to grant forgiveness, to assign penance, and to keep millions in a state of perpetual spiritual dependency. Your body might belong to you for a few fleeting decades, but your soul and every act performed by that body belonged to God, and the Church was his sole unforgiving gatekeeper. If the Church fought for the eternal soul, the second great army, the army of the law, fought for something far more tangible: property. In the rigid, hierarchical world of medieval Europe, everything depended on the bloodline. Land, titles, wealth, and power were all passed down through a clear, undisputed line of male inheritance. From the king on his throne to the smallest landowner, the legitimacy of one's heir was the cornerstone of social and political order. In this context, sex was not a private matter of love or desire. It was a public contract with profound legal and economic consequences. And when that contract was disputed, the law would intervene with a brutal, invasive, and utterly humiliating force. The most spectacular arena for this legal intrusion was the impotence trial. Annulment of a marriage was incredibly difficult to obtain, But one of the few accepted grounds was a man's inability to consummate the union. If a wife, after a faiki, typically 3 years, claimed her husband was impotent and their marriage was unfulfilled, she could sue for annulment. What followed was one of the most bizarre and degrading legal spectacles imaginable. The courtroom was transformed into a medical theater, and the husband's genitals became the star exhibit. The accused man would be subjected to a series of humiliating examinations. A panel of court-appointed legal and medical experts would physically inspect him, searching for any defects that might prevent an erection. They would pull, prod, and measure, all while debating his physical state in cold, legalistic Latin. If this initial inspection proved inconclusive, the court would escalate the proceedings. Sometimes, the husband would be ordered to demonstrate his virility in front of the court officials. He might be required to attempt an erection, alone or sometimes with the help of his wife, while the experts observed. In the most extreme cases, the court would order a trial by Congress. This was the ultimate test. The husband and wife would be ordered to attempt intercourse in a specially prepared bed, often right in the courtroom or an adjacent chamber. They were surrounded by a crowd of witnesses, judges, lawyers, midwives, and sometimes even curious members of the public. These official voyeurs would watch, comment, and offer encouragement, their presence intended to ensure that no fraud was being committed. It was a legal proceeding that combined the cold scrutiny of a courtroom with the public spectacle of a circus sideshow. Imagine the sheer psychological horror of being ordered to perform the most intimate act of your life, on command, before a judgmental audience, knowing that your entire future, your reputation, and your marriage depended on your body's response. Many men, understandably, failed under such pressure and were declared legally impotent, their marriage annulled, their name disgraced. This obsession with consummation was most intense at the highest levels of society. For royalty and the high nobility, a marriage was a treaty between nations, an alliance sealed with a wedding. The consummation of that marriage was not just a personal matter, it was an act of state, and it required official witnesses. When a king or prince married, it was common practice for a procession of high-ranking nobles, bishops, and courtiers to escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber. They would watch as the couple got into bed, pull the curtains, and then often wait outside the door or even in the room until the act was completed. A blood-stained bedsheet was sometimes displayed the next morning as public proof that the union was now legally binding and that any resulting child was a legitimate heir. For the ruling class, there was no such thing as a private wedding night. The bedroom was an extension of the throne room, and sex was a public performance of political duty. But the law's intrusion wasn't just about ensuring procreation. It was also about punishing its illicit forms. Adultery was seen not as a private betrayal, but as a crime against the social order. It threatened the sanctity of the bloodline, raising the terrifying possibility that a man might leave his entire inheritance to a child who was not his own. The punishments were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. A common form of punishment was the adulterer's parade. The guilty couple would be stripped half-naked, tied together back-to-back or face-to-face, and march through the streets of their town. A town crier would walk ahead of them, proclaiming their crime to the jeering crowds. People would throw garbage, rotten food, and animal dung at them. The goal was not just to punish the body, but to permanently destroy their social standing, to brand them with a shame that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In some parts of Europe, the punishments were even more symbolic. A woman might have her hair shorn off, a universal sign of shame, while her lover might be forced to lead her through the town on a leash as if she were an animal. The law, in its relentless pursuit of order, had declared war on privacy. It did not care for the emotional nuances of a relationship, for love or for heartbreak. It saw human beings as links in a chain of inheritance. Your body was a vessel for the bloodline. Your bedroom was a potential crime scene. Your desires were a threat to the stability of the state. In this brutal calculus, there was no room for secrets. The church may have claimed your soul, but the law laid a far more tangible claim. It owned your body, your marriage, and your children, and it would use the full force of public humiliation to enforce that ownership. The third army to wage war on the medieval body was the army of medicine. But this was not an army of enlightened healers. It was an army fighting in the dark, armed with flawed maps and fantastical weapons, waging a desperate and often catastrophic war against an enemy it fundamentally misunderstood: human biology. Medieval medicine was not a science. It was a blend of ancient Greek theory, Christian dogma, and pure superstition. And when it turned its confused gaze upon the intimate workings of the human body, the results were a bizarre mixture of the comical, the dangerous, and the profoundly disturbing. The entire theoretical framework of medieval medicine rested on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every individual was believed to have a unique balance of these four fluids, and illness was simply a state of imbalance. A person's temperament, their health, and even their sexual appetite were all dictated by which humor was dominant. But this elegant symmetrical theory had very little to do with the messy reality of the human body. When faced with the complexities of female reproductive health, for instance, medieval physicians abandoned even this flawed logic and descended into pure fantasy. Their greatest and most influential invention was the terrifying concept of the wandering womb. To the medieval medical mind, the womb, or uterus, was not a stable, fixed organ. It was a separate living creature inside a woman's body, an animal with its own desires and motivations. The Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia described it as an animal within an animal. This creature, they believed, had an intense craving for moisture and aversions to certain smells. If a woman remained celibate for too long, her womb would become dry and light. Desperate for moisture, it would detach itself from its moorings and begin to wander throughout her body in search of it, wreaking havoc as it went. This theory of the wandering womb became the go-to explanation for an entire catalog of female ailments, collectively known as hysteria, or suffocation of the mother. If the womb traveled upwards, it could press against the diaphragm, causing breathlessness, seizures, and dizziness. If it pressed against the liver, it could cause loss of voice and a deathly pallor. The symptoms were vast and varied, but the diagnosis was almost always the same. The woman's womb was on the move, and it needed to be lured back to its proper place. The treatments were as bizarre as the theory. Physicians developed a two-pronged strategy. First, they had to drive the womb down from the upper body. To do this, they would apply foul-smelling substances to the woman's nose and mouth, burning hair, rancid oil, or the smoke from extinguished oil lamps. The idea was that the womb, being a delicate creature, would be repulsed by the horrible stench and flee downwards. The second step was to entice the womb to return to its home. This was done by applying sweet-smelling perfumes and lotions to the woman's thighs and genitals. The womb, attracted by the pleasant aroma, would supposedly be lured back into its correct position. But if the cause of the wandering womb was a lack of moisture from sexual activity, the most direct cure was, logically, to provide that moisture. This led to one of the strangest prescriptions in medical history. Physicians would literally prescribe orgasms as a medical treatment for hysteria. For married women, regular intercourse with their husbands was prescribed. But for unmarried women, virgins or widows, this presented a moral problem. The solution was a form of medicalized masturbation. A physician, or more commonly, a licensed midwife, would manually stimulate the woman's genitals until she experienced what they called a paroxysm, releasing the supposedly dangerous buildup of female seed and rehydrating the thirsty womb. This wasn't seen as a sexual act, but as a purely mechanical medical procedure, like bloodletting or applying leeches. It was a bizarre intersection where the Church's condemnation of lust collided with medicine's absurd theories, creating a situation where an act that would send you to confession could also be prescribed by your doctor. While medicine's view of female sexuality was fantastical, its approach to reproductive control was dangerously real. The church forbade contraception, but people desperately sought ways to control the size of their families. This demand was met by a black market of folk remedies and quasi-medical advice, a terrifying pharmacopoeia of magical thinking and lethal ingredients. The line between contraception and abortion was blurry, and the methods used were often wildly ineffective and incredibly dangerous. Medical and folk texts describe a host of contraceptive methods. Some were based on sympathetic magic, like the advice for a woman to wear a pouch around her neck containing the powdered testicles of a weasel. Others were based on flawed observation, like the belief that a woman could not conceive if she jumped up and down or sneezed violently after intercourse. But many involved ingesting or inserting dangerous substances. Women were advised to drink infusions of toxic herbs like pennyroyal or tansy, which could indeed cause miscarriage, but could also cause kidney failure, liver damage, and death. Some texts even recommended drinking potions containing lead, mercury, or arsenic, poisons that would certainly prevent a pregnancy by killing the woman who took them. The war of medieval medicine against the body was a war fought with imaginary monsters and real poisons. It was a conflict born of profound ignorance, where the human body was a mysterious, rebellious territory governed by wandering animals and volatile fluids. In their desperate attempt to impose order on a system they did not understand, they created theories that pathologized female anatomy and prescribed treatments that ranged from the absurd to the lethal. The church policed the soul, the law policed the bloodline, but the physicians, in their well-intentioned blindness, waged a direct and often deadly war on the flesh itself. While the great armies of the church, the law, and medicine waged their wars from the top down, a fourth, secret war was being fought from the bottom up. This was the insurgency of magic, a guerrilla war fought in the shadows, in the forests, and in the quiet corners of peasant huts. It was the desperate and often dangerous attempt by ordinary people to seize some measure of control in a world that sought to regulate their every impulse. If the church told you who you could not desire, and the law told you who you must desire, magic offered a tantalizing forbidden promise: the power to make anyone desire you. This was not the high ceremonial magic of learned occultists. This was folk magic, a gritty, practical craft passed down through whispers and clandestine traditions. It was a weapon of the powerless, and its primary target was the human heart. In an age of arranged marriages and rigid social hierarchies, love was a luxury few could afford. But lust, desire, and obsession, these, it was believed, could be engineered. The primary tool in this shadow war was the love potion, or filter. The surviving texts and trial records from the period reveal a startling and often stomach-turning pharmacopoeia of magical ingredients. These were not the romanticized potions of fairy tales. They were visceral, deeply personal, and often grotesque concoctions built on the principle of sympathetic magic. To bind someone to you, you had to incorporate a part of yourself or a part of the natural world into them. The most common ingredients were bodily fluids and excretions, believed to be potent carriers of a person's essence. A woman seeking to ensnare a man might be instructed to bake a loaf of bread, but not with water. She was to mix the flour with her own sweat, saliva, and menstrual blood. In some recipes, she would knead the dough with her bare buttocks, quite literally embedding her physical self into the food. The unsuspecting man would then be fed this love bread, and in consuming her essence would become magically bound to her. Other recipes called for urine mixed into wine, or for scrapings from the skin or strands of hair to be secretly added to a target's meal. When these personal ingredients were not enough, the recipes turned to the natural world, often to its most unsettling corners. Earthworms, the brains of a cat or a sparrow, or the testicles of a rooster might be ground into a powder and mixed with wine. The goal was to transfer the desired quality, the fertility of the worms, the cunning of the cat, to the person who consumed the potion. but the most powerful and most forbidden ingredients came from the one place that held the ultimate magical potency: the dead. Necromancy was not just about speaking to spirits, it was about harvesting the residual power of a departed soul. The most potent love charms often required components taken from a human corpse, particularly from the bodies of unbaptized infants or executed criminals who had died a violent death. A finger, a sliver of bone, or a piece of the winding sheet that had wrapped the body were considered items of immense power. One particularly horrifying recipe for a charm to win a woman's love required the man to obtain a piece of a dead man's flesh, which he was to secretly place under the woman's pillow or threshold. The belief was that the lingering life force in the dead flesh would supernaturally ignite passion in the living. Magic was not just used to create desire, it was also used to destroy it. This was the dark side of love magic, the curse of impotence, or ligature. It was widely believed that a witch or a spurned lover could, through a magical spell, tie up the knots of a man's virility, rendering him impotent. This was a terrifyingly common accusation in medieval society and was often used to explain a husband's inability to consummate a marriage. The methods were varied. A witch might secretly tie a series of knots in a leather cord or a piece of string while uttering a curse, and then hide the cord. As long as the knots remained tied, the man's nature would be tied as well. These curses were taken so seriously that they were discussed in theological texts and prosecuted in both ecclesiastical and secular courts. Men would live in constant fear that a jealous rival or a neighborhood crone could, with a simple piece of string, unman them completely. In this chaotic world of magical warfare, people sought protection. This created a thriving market for amulets and countercharms. A man might wear an amulet made from a wolf's penis to ward off curses of impotence. A woman might wear one made from a stone with a natural hole in it to promote her own fertility. These objects were the magical shields and armor in the unending invisible war for control of the body. The war of magic was a war of desperation. It was the last resort for those who had no other power. In a world where your marriage was a legal contract, your pleasure was a sin, and your body was a medical mystery, magic offered a sliver of agency. It was a dangerous, often disgusting, and deeply forbidden path, but it was a path. It was the belief that even a poor peasant woman, with the right ingredients and the right words, could bend the will of a powerful man to her own. It was a profane declaration of independence, a desperate attempt to become a commander rather than just a casualty on the brutal battlefield of the medieval body. And so, the war raged on. 4 great armies, locked in an eternal struggle over the most intimate territory imaginable, the human body. The Church, in its crusade for the soul, mapped every inch of human desire and branded it with the cartography of sin, turning the bedroom into a courtroom for the soul. The law, in its relentless pursuit of order, dragged the marital bed into the public square, transforming the act of love into a legal deposition to be witnessed and verified. The army of medicine, blind and confused, waged a misguided war against biology itself, inventing phantom diseases like the wandering womb and prescribing remedies that were often as deadly as the ailments they sought to cure. And rising from the muck was the insurgency of magic, the guerrilla warfare of the common folk, fighting back with grotesque potions and whispered curses in a desperate bid to reclaim some sliver of personal power. These armies did not fight in isolation. Their battle lines crossed and blurred, creating a world of profound and maddening contradictions. A woman could be prescribed an orgasm by her doctor to cure her hysteria, and then be forced to confess that very act as the sin of lust to her priest. A man's inability to perform his marital duty could be simultaneously diagnosed as a medical condition, prosecuted as a legal failure, and blamed on the magical knot-tying of a neighborhood witch. The medieval body was a land under multiple, competing occupations, and the average person was simply a civilian caught in the crossfire, trying to navigate the contradictory laws of the warring factions that claimed ownership over their flesh. The true horror of the medieval relationship with sex was not, as we so often imagine, one of pious, simple-minded repression. It was the horror of constant, suffocating, and absolute surveillance. The single most defining feature of this entire landscape was the complete and total absence of what we now consider a fundamental human right: privacy. Privacy, the idea that what you do with your own body in your own space is your own business, was not a concept that existed. In fact, the very desire for privacy was seen as deeply suspicious. Why would you want to be alone unless you were plotting a crime, committing a sin, or casting a spell? Your body, your desires, and your actions were the property of your community, your Lord, your King, and your God. They were all subject to public scrutiny, to legal judgment, and to divine regulation. There was no behind closed doors, because every door, from the peasant's hovel to the royal bedchamber, was open to the intrusion of a priest, a judge, a physician, or a neighbor. We look back on this time with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity at these strange and brutal practices that seem so alien to us. But the war for the body is never truly over. The names of the armies may change, but the battle continues. The church's penitentials have been replaced by online debates about morality. The law's public shaming parades have evolved into the digital witch hunts of social media. Medicine's bizarre theories have given way to complex debates over reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. And the folk magic of the love potion has been sanitized into the billion-dollar industries of dating apps and wellness products that promise to engineer our desirability. The next time you close your bedroom door, take a moment to appreciate that simple act. That click of the lock is a sound that would have been an incomprehensible luxury to our medieval ancestors. It is a declaration of a right that was won through centuries of struggle. It is the sound of a peace treaty, however fragile, in the 1,000-year war for control of the human body. That small, private space is not just a room. It is a sanctuary, built on the ruins of a world where such a sanctuary was not just impossible, but a sin.